Hi everyone, it's Teresa from Sewing Together and I am here to have a chat about the final part of our Celestial Beauty sew along. So far what we have done is we have prepared our English paper piecing pieces. So we've basted our fabric to our pieces, we've stitched our blocks together, and then we've appliqued our blocks to our background. So what we need to do now is we need to think about how we are going to put our quilt top together, how we're going to quilt it, and whether or not quilt as you go is the method that we want to use for this, and a few little options for how we would quilt it. Now, excuse me, I'm using a different technology today, so bear with me. It hopefully will go to plan. So I'm just going to swap the camera angles and we can have a look at our blocks. Okay, so I still am a little unsure about how many blocks I'm actually going to complete for this quilt. So at the moment I've got 4 blocks with me, and when I appliqued my block to the back, or my EPP to the background, what I found was that it did pull my background block in a little bit. So I had a really good look at the blocks and measured them all and decided that I was going to trim my blocks down to 9.5 inches, which will make them 9 inches finished. So that's going to give me about 3/4 of an inch or so outside of each of the appliqued pieces to whatever sashing or however I decide to join them. So the next step, if I'm going to make my complete block, my complete quilt top, would be to trim all of my appliqued blocks to the same size. So there's no right or wrong size. You can make your blocks whatever size you want. The important thing is that all of your blocks are the same size. So if you're going to do quilt as you go, you don't need to trim your blocks. You can trim your blocks after you've done the quilting. But you do need to make sure that they are all quilted so they're the same size. So I'll talk about quilts as you go in a moment, but what I'm going to do for firstly is I want to talk to you about those that are going to make their complete quilt top in one go. So I have got here just a white piece of fabric, and the white is the same as what I've used for my inset pieces for my Celestial Beauty blocks. So if I just wanted a really simple quilt layout, I could just simply stitch them together with no sashing, and they would look fabulous. They are only, they're a relatively small block in that they're going to be 9 inches when they're finished, and so if I'm wanting a little bit more space and make my quilt a little bit bigger, I could actually add in a sashing. So if I was to use the white, that gives you a bit of an idea about how the white would look as a sashing. Of course, this block over here hasn't been trimmed as yet, so what I might do, just so that it looks a little bit more cohesive, is I'll put my 2 trimmed blocks at the top and my 2 untrimmed blocks at the bottom. There we go. So you can see that the white really makes the appliques pop. You could add in a really cute little cornerstone. Let's pop in cute little cornerstone. And you could have a really quickly finished little quilt, and it would look wonderful. And you could get your quilt top if you wanted. You can make as many blocks as you like. You could add a border to the outside if you chose to. You can build your quilt the way that you want to. So I'm going to take this out. What I've decided to do with mine is I am actually going to add a little bit of a feature sashing. So I'm going to pull these 2 down, separate these 2 out a little bit, and what I'm going to do with mine is that I've got my quilt, I've got my sashing already cut, which you can tell with the white fabric, but what I'm going to do, myself a little bit of a white border there, is I'm actually going to add some what will be 2-inch finished squares around my blocks. I'll just layer this through here. And I've cut these from the offcuts of my blocks. So when I've cut my diamond shaped pieces out, I've had some pieces that were left. Put them in there. And I am going to have, so you can see a little bit better. Take this out of the way. Let's not put the red with the red. Okay, pink, red, green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a border of white surrounding my block, and then I'm going to have a sashing of 2-inch squares in between all my blocks. So I probably will do only about, I might do 9 blocks. I might do 6 blocks, so it will be 2 blocks across and 3 blocks down. I actually want mine just as a little quilt that's small enough to be dragged around by a little person, but big enough to cover them on the lounge so they can just have a little cuddle rug. So I'm going to just use my bits and pieces and put some little 2-inch blocks in between. Now, I can't give you measurements for what the sashing is, because you might find that your centre blocks are a different size to mine. So if you're going to trim them back to 9.5 inches, you will cut your sashing at 2 inches. Let me just double check that. I've got a ruler here. Yep. My sashing is cut at 2 inches and my blocks are cut at 2.5 inches. So cut measurements, 9.5, 2 and 2.5. So they're the cut measurements, they're not the finished measurements. So they will come back to 9, 1.5 inches and 2 inches. So that will give us, once we add our white sashing onto our block, it will actually give us a 12-inch finished block, which means that we'll have an even division of 2-inch finished squares to go around our quilt. And I may even pull this one out and actually just have it just as a little white square, like a sashing. So like a little opposite effect from here to here. But I'll play with that once I've got a few pieces stitched together. So that's a couple of suggestions for you if you're going to put your quilt together in one piece before you decide to quilt it. Now, everybody has their different preferences and there is no right or wrong with Quilt As You Go. If you have a domestic machine with not a lot of space, Quilt As You Go can make your quilting process a whole lot easier. And particularly for those of you who aren't confident with free motion quilting, having to turn a larger quilt under your machine can be a nightmare. So if you're wanting to do Quilt As You Go, pop these out of the way. I've got my piece of wadding here. I'm going to go fluffy side up, pop it on the top, and I'm going to use one of my untrimmed blocks to pop it on there. I would have my backing fabric as well. What I really need to stress to you about Quilt As You Go is that whatever shape your quilt block is when you quilt it, that's the way it's going to remain. So when you're quilting a whole quilt top, you've got a little bit maneuverability in that you can push your quilt around to make it fit and you can maneuver it around a little bit. Once your blocks are quilted, you don't have that option. So if you quilt them so that they're crooked and you pull them out of shape a little bit, that's how they stay. So my recommendation for anyone who is going to do them as Quilt As You Go, you'll have your backing fabric, you'll have your wadding. Whatever wadding you're going to use, actually mark a line on your wadding using a quilt ruler the size of your block. So if your square is, my blocks have come back down to about 9 3/4 inches. So I would mark a 9 3/4 inch square on my wadding, and then I would make sure that I smooth my block and pin it out to that marked line so that I know when I quilt my block, I'm actually quilting it as a square block. So for your quilt as you go, it's really important that you have your blocks the right shape before you quilt them, because if they're pulled out of shape, you don't have the option of pulling them back into shape after they're quilted. You can a little bit, but it's not quite as easy. So get them nice and square to start with. That's next door's puppy dog can hear me, so of course on cue he starts to bark. If the next step is actually to talk to you about the quilting. So you have loads and loads of options. Let me move that out of the way. So it will depend on, firstly, how you feel about quilting, whether or not it's something you enjoy or whether it's just something that needs to be done to hold your project together. I love free motion quilting. I am not a traditional hand quilter. For those of you that are not aware, I live in Brisbane in Australia, and our winter temperatures, generally our daytime temperatures, are about 25 degrees Celsius. So a really, really cold day for us in Queensland in winter, which is usually only a couple of days a year, is we may have a couple of days of the year which are under 20 degrees. So for me, hand quilting with a quilt on my lap is just not a feasible option, although I have to say I do love the look of it and I love the peacefulness of it. So I do have a little way of adding my little piece of hand stitching to it. For me, I like to make a whole quilt top. I often will stabilise my quilt then with using my walking foot on my machine, and then add free motion quilting decorative touches. So to me, if you ever have to think about what you're going to put on a quilt, the answer for me is always quilted feathers. So free motion quilting feathers. So that's what I will always turn to if someone says, what should I quilt? Feathers, always feathers. But I know that not everybody is really confident with their free motion quilting. So a lot of the work is already done for you. So if you were just to put your quilt blocks with just a simple sashing or with no sashing, you can simply stitch down your side. You can stitch around your circles, and then you could put a couple of concentric circles around it, or you could simply stitch your circle around and then you could stitch from point to point all the way through your stars, or you could stitch around your star points. You could stitch on the inside of your star points. You do need something to hold your star in place. Quilting is not just there as a decorative feature. Quilting, when you quilt through your 3 layers of your project, the quilting actually takes the stress off the seams on your top of your quilt. So if you've got lots of seams that may be a little bit smaller, or you've got some fabric that you feel is a little bit fragile, be more heavy-handed with your quilting, because that will stabilize the top of the quilt down, and you've got one full layer on your backing which is supporting the whole of the quilt, and that's what takes the stress as opposed to the seams on the top of your quilt. I'm making my quilt probably for a little person, and so that I know it's going to have a rough life, and I'm fine with that. I am happy for it to be wrecked, and I will make a new one, but I will be more heavy-handed with my quilting, because that will add more stability to it, and it will prolong its lifespan. I know that the dog will sit on it and it will be used to make forts and cubby houses and probably go camping, and that's fine, because all my quilts are machine washable. Pop them in the washing machine, in the dryer, and they're ready to go again. I will be using for this one, because it's got a white background, I will be using, and because it's for a little person and will probably get food on it, I'm going to use 100% polyester wadding. It's got a moderate loft, and so I will get some nice shape with my quilting as well, which is also what I like. I know a lot of people like to use a really like a flat cotton wadding, 100% cotton wadding, which is very, very flat. I prefer to have some more shape to my quilting, so that's why I go to a wadding with a higher loft. If it is a little bit more if it's to go on a bed, or if it's a little bit more special, I will use a 100% wool wadding, which is actually very cool, or a wool polyester blend. So they have the highest loft, and they're beautiful to work with, and even if you put lots of quilting on them, they still remain beautiful and soft and drapey. If you have a cotton wadding and you add lots of quilting to it, it can become quite stiff, which is really great if you're wanting to create a wall hanging, because it can get a nice flat surface and lots of quilting and will give you stability for your wall hanging. But also if you're wanting to hand quilt, or you're wanting it for a young child to put over them on a bed or something like that, then cotton and natural fibre is always best. But this is going to be more like a floor mat, perhaps cuddle under the TV as they get cuddle underneath watching TV when they get a little bit bigger. So it's not going to be a baby quilt. So now some other options are to talk to you about what type of thread to use. So when you're doing your quilting, there's two different schools of thought that's going to go into it. So if you use a really fine thread, and I've got Daco Bob here, which is beautiful on your machine. Now a really fine thread like Daco Bob, you can see on there, even though it's a cream, you can see because it's such a fine thread, what it's going to do is it is absolutely going to disappear. And you're not going to see the thread itself. What you're going to see is the shadow that's created by your roll stitching. So in the polyester wadding, what will happen is when we quilt, that will pull down the fibres, lock them tight together, and we will have a shadow. And that's what's going to give us our shape and lovely texture, is those light and shadows. And the stitching itself will be invisible. The other end of the scale that you can go to, well, this is not quite the other end of the scale, is that you can use a thread such as this one, which is called King Tut, and it's a much more heavier thread, still suitable for use on your regular sewing machine. But you can see, even under my camera, you can actually see that the thread itself is visible. And so it's going to remain visible. You will still get your light and your shadows, but you will actually see the thread. So if you're wanting to add some more colour and some dimension, and maybe if you're not happy with a plain background and you want to add some colour and texture to it, you can go to a heavier weight thread and add some quilting to it, and the thread and the stitches will be obvious, and that can change the whole look of your quilt. So there's no right or wrong, it's just the finished effect that you want. Now on that note, having said that, I like to machine quilt. What I also like to do is I love big stitch hand quilting. So, so done with generally a pearl thread or stranded cotton, and it's a big stitch. It's not little fine stitches like beautiful fine hand quilting. It's a decorative stitch, and it's often done in a contrast colour, and it's, I guess it's sashiko inspired, in that it takes those beautiful functional sashiko and boro stitches, and you're adding it to any particular quilting that you like. So I've got a couple of spools here of this is called Eleganza from Wonderful, and it is a Pearl 8 thread, and if I just unwind that there, that tail out. No, I've gone the wrong way. Oh no. Let's go with the green and see if we can get the green tail out. There we go. So you can see that it's a pearl 8 thread. So you can see it's got a beautiful luster to it. It's a gorgeous thread. I love stitching with this. And you can actually add some decorative stitches. So I'm thinking that maybe what I might do is that I might actually add a couple of rows of nice big stitches around my circles. So I'll have it all stabilized by machine first. So probably what I will do is I will stitch around the blocks, and I'll actually probably stitch around the stars as well. And I may stitch inside the stars too, just to keep them nice and stable, or I'll stitch across just to hold them in place. I will do something to hold and stabilize all my quilting. And then I'll add some nice big running stitches around the outside of my blocks with, this is called Eleganza. So it's a pearl 8 cotton. There's lots of different ones on the market, but the Eleganza from Wonderful is just the most divine thread to work with. It's so beautiful. It's just so lovely. These come in a spool, which is a slightly higher quantity, or you can get them on a ball as well. But I just find I like the spools because they actually fit in my sewing bag, because they're just the same size as a regular spool of thread. So they're just easier to carry than a ball. Now, was one thing that I didn't mention, which is really, really remiss of me, with regards to the quilting and the stabilizing your quilt. Stabilizing around the outside of your block is really easy to do because we've just got an applique piece to a background, so it's nice and simple, and we're stitching through a layer of fabric. We can't just stitch in the ditch around our English paper pieces to stabilize them, because our seams are pressed open. So when we're English paper piecing, we have our seams for the pink section are pressed to the pink because of the way that we've basted. If I flip this over, okay, you can see that our seams are pressed open. So if we were to quilt just simply in the ditch or between our pieces, we'd only be stitching on our stitching threads, and that's not going to hold our quilt securely. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we do our quilting as traditionally you will do it about a 1/4 inch outside that stitching line. So you could stitch a 1/4 inch inside, and you could stitch a 1/4 inch either side of your center. So that will give you some options. Just make sure that you don't just stitch in the ditch where your English paper piecing is, and that applies to any English paper pieced quilt. So you do need to think about the way that you're going to quilt it, because you can't stitch in the ditch. It just won't be secure enough. Okay, so yeah, I think a little bit of hand stitching, a little bit of a focal point. Really like the lovely golden yellow with it, and the green as well, because it blends in quite well with those, but I'm thinking maybe the golden yellow. So I hope that's given you some ideas for how to finish off your quilt. Of course, you've just got regular square blocks, so you can use any different layout that you like. The important thing is just to remember that all your blocks need to be trimmed to the same size. If you're doing them as quilt as you go, you need to have them nice and square and then trim them to the same size. You don't need to trim them beforehand. And have fun with it. You can make as many blocks as you like, and I hope you have enjoyed our sew along. Don't forget to follow and post some photos. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and post some photos of your quilt as it's progressing, and tag Sewn Together Australia so we can see them and we can share them with other people who are working along. If you haven't joined our sew along group as well, if you go to Sewn Together Australia's Facebook page and search for groups, you can get yourself added to the group. and we will be starting another sew along fairly soon. So I hope you've enjoyed this one, and we look forward to seeing what you've created. And any questions, don't forget to pop us an email. We'll see you soon. Bye.